Hello everyone, this is Blake with the Glimmer Gang, and we are here today going over the Sapphire Emerald Turquoise High Five deck. This is probably still one of the cheapest competitive decks right now, with a lot of cards coming from the starter decks and running 0 legendaries. If you are just getting into Lorcana and trying to jump into the competitive scene, or just love the act of questing, this may be the deck for you. Again, while this deck is pretty budget, it has still proven itself competition worthy, making the top 8 cut of a few 1K tournaments over the last few months, and we'll be getting a few new tools in the upcoming Rise of the Floodborn set. Just for a quick breakdown, first we'll go over our deck list starting with our glimmers from lowest to highest cost, then our actions, and then item cards if there are any, while explaining their importance to the deck. Then I will go over some tech options or decent replacements if you're struggling to come across certain cards for the deck. Then we'll end with the talks of strategy, what you should mulligan for, and certain lines of play or combos you can pull off if there are any for the deck. So without further ado, let's get cracking. To start off with our glimmers, for our 1 costs, we are running 4 copies each of both Flounder and the Duke of Wesselton, namely because these are the only options we have for now. Their 2/2 stat line is part of the big weakness of the deck, as you'll see when we get to our 2 costs, but there really isn't anything we can do about this until we get our new cards in Rise of the Floodborn. Starting off our 2 costs, we have 4 copies of Flynn Rider, Charming Rogue, who has the ability to have your opponent discard a card on top of being a 2-lore quester. He's a pretty solid card that will demand answering from your opponent, and unless they have a cheap removal option, they're going to have to discard a card if they want to get rid of him. So even if he doesn't take out what's challenging him, your opponent still loses a card, which is pretty solid. Our second 2 cost at 4 copies is going to be Aurora Regal Princess, a 2/2 with 2 lore. This is our shift target for our Aurora Dreaming Guardian, and it's just solid on her own, being able to quest for 2 lore. Finally, at 2 copies, we have Phil at 3/1 with support, so he's very useful to help your characters challenge into high willpower characters, and can even charge in with its solid 3 strength when needed, especially those pesky Simbas that Amber players like to play so much on turn 2. A solid tech card. For our 3 costs, we'll start with 3 copies of Cheshire Cat, a solid 2-lore quester with the ability to take out whoever banishes him in a challenge. Really good for making your opponent think twice about challenging, especially if they only have one big thing on board, and can sometimes just sneak away just chipping towards your lore total for a couple turns because of it. Our second 3 cost at 3 copies is going to be Jasper, who has one of the most solid bodies in our deck at 2/4, and his ability is great as well, with stopping an opponent's character from questing for a turn while you get to keep questing away, which in an aggro versus aggro match can be key in making sure you stay ahead of your opponent. Lastly, we have 3 copies of Jasmine Disguised, who is just a solid 3/3 that can quest for 2, which what we want for this deck is questing ahead of curve and getting to 20 as fast as possible. 4 costs we only have 2 of at 4 copies each, with Hans Scheming Prince and Tinkerbell most helpful. Hans again is questing ahead of curve with 3 lore at the 4 cost slot, which is above average, and by this point should be getting us to the end of the game. Tinkerbell is a solid toolkit in being evasive, being able to challenge enemy evasives, and being able to quest for 2 lore herself. But her ability also grants evasive to another glimmer for the turn, and there are some fun plays that you can do with that we'll get into in the strategies portion. Now here we are at our top end already with our 5 costs. There is a reason this deck is called High Five after all. So let's start off with the face card of many Emerald players, especially aggro ones, with 4 copies of Cusco Temperamental Emperor. Our only uninkable, but for good reason, as he's a 2/4 stat line, and he's a 3-lore quester with ward, and the ability No Touchy, which banishes the challenger when he's banished in a challenge, much like Cheshire Cat. Ward in this game almost always guarantees this character will be questing next turn, and being able to guarantee yourself 3 lore is amazing. Not only that, but targeted removal does not work on him, so he must be challenged, in which he'll take out whatever takes him out. Or your opponent needs to use a Be Prepared or 2 Grab Your Swords in order to be taken out before he quests. Cusco is the star of the deck. Next up, we have 4 copies of the Mad Hatter, another 2/4/3 lore quester, but his ability gives us some of the only card draw that we have for this deck, in which whenever he is challenged, we get to draw a card. So he's pretty solid with that ability, especially for this deck. We will end up top decking a lot, so having him questing and potentially getting us more cards to play is pretty good. For our Sapphire choices, we have 4 copies of the Floodborn Aurora Dreaming Guardian, which gives our other characters Ward, and she also has a solid stat line as a 3/5. She helps make sure cards like Cheshire Cat and Mad Hatter only get challenged so that they can use their effects to their fullest, and if you're lucky enough to get 2 of these online, it can get really challenging to deal with for your opponent. Lastly, but certainly not least for our Glimmers, is Maleficent Uninvited with an amazing 3 strength and 6 willpower stat line, and yet another 3 lore quester. While she is more susceptible to hard removal, she is the queen of the deck when it comes to soaking up damage-based removal and still being able to survive to quest. She is our go-to for those matchups. For actions and songs, this particular build only runs 2, the first being 2 copies of Develop Your Brain. It's a little bit more draw, and you do get the choice of what you draw between 2 cards, but this can feel really bad late in the game because we usually only go to 5 ink. So to play this and having 2 5-drops to choose from and not being able to play them just feels bad. So definitely one of the cards that I recommend swapping out for potential tech options until we get better draw or 1 costs. Our other action is a song, with Let It Go being our only removal option for the game, which is needed since our Glimmers are not really great at controlling the board on their own. And we definitely got plenty of 5-drops that can sing it if necessary. So we definitely need all 4 copies of those. This deck does run 1 item with 3 copies to finish it off with Eye of Fates. This item lets you exert it and give a Glimmer an extra lore to quest with, so this card can sneak in and boost your lore in a way your opponent isn't suspecting if they are unfamiliar with the matchup. So that is our 60 card deck. Let's take a look at some other options that you may want to consider running for the deck. First off is Donald Duck Strutting His Stuff, which have 5 cost Inkable, 4/3 with Ward at common rarity. He can make a solid stand-in for Cusco if you're having trouble getting all 4 copies needed. You do lose out on 1 lore though, but he's the closest you have to a potential replacement. Also, if you do have Cusco, you may also choose to run him alongside Cusco and have a very ward-heavy top end that, again, with ward, almost guarantees these characters will be able to quest, which makes them strong options for finishing out the game. I would play with the numbers for Dreaming Guardian or Mad Hatter to make room for him if that's what you want to do. If you want to go even more ward-focused, some have even squeezed in a few copies of Aladdin Prince Ali. A tech option that I personally run that has helped me out in some matchups is Beast Wolfsbane. While his second ability rarely comes into effect, his rush ability usually takes opponents by surprise and really helps this deck be able to control the board where it normally wouldn't. If he survives, he's also a 2 lore quester, which is pretty solid as well. He is a legendary card though, so he can be expensive to get a hold of. But you do only want to run 1 or 2 copies, so don't feel like you have to get a playset to play him. Lastly, this option has made its way into the top 8 in some lists as well, and that is Mickey Mouse Detective, usually taking the place of Jasmine in most lists. This guy gives you the opportunity to ramp up to 5 ink a turn sooner, and for some matchups this can let you run away with the game if your opponent has no way of catching up or dealing with your 5-drops that you'll start dropping every turn. Another removal option that some people are trying is the song Mother Knows Best, which bounces a chosen character back to the owner's hand. This one is definitely a little trickier to handle because those characters bounced will return again in some form. And in the later game, a lot of cards have good enter the battlefield abilities that will probably benefit your opponent more than they will you. But it has seen some success and is worth considering for this deck. The main strategy for this deck is to quest hard and fast, so your mulligan should reflect that. For your first match, you mainly just want to make sure that your hand has cards to play for at least the first 3 or 4 turns. Starting off with no early game plays is almost a guaranteed loss for this deck, so make sure that you have your first few turns in hand. Just a fun reminder, Dreaming Guardian can be your turn 3 play if you have Regal Princess in hand. Looking for specific cards is going to depend on your matchups, so in aggro Amber build you'll want to look for Phil or Dreaming Guardian to take care of Simba, and then you want Jasper to slow down your opponent's questing. And then, like I mentioned with Maleficent Uninvited, you'll want to have her around for those steel matchups. As our biggest enemy with Steel Ink can shift to Giant Tink and have it sing Grab Your Swords, dealing 3 damage to all of our characters, and that wipes out nearly everything that we can possibly play from turns 1 through 4. So having Maleficent is essential to try surviving that onslaught of damage. Otherwise, this deck is pretty straightforward, in which you play a Glimmer every turn, quest every turn, and just get to 20 lore as fast as you can. Some cards I want to note that have some neat tricks to them. As I mentioned, Aurora Dreaming Guardian can be a turn 3 play, which also means Let It Go can be a song as early as turn 3 as well. Not many matchups I would use this line of play, but it is a tool in your back pocket if the opportunity shows itself. Tinkerbell can choose your opponent's character to give evasive to. In some aggro matchups, like against Amber, they like to hide their Lilos behind their high willpower bodyguards. So, as a workaround, if you don't have a Let It Go or a character strong enough to take out the bodyguard, you can play Tinkerbell to give the bodyguard evasive so that your characters, who can't challenge them now, can go straight for whatever character is hiding behind that bodyguard. Lastly, a tip for the Eye of Fates. Hold on to these until you have characters that can immediately use them, especially in steel matchups. Playing this card on an empty field just feels really bad and does not help you at all. And it also telegraphs the lore count ahead of time too, so your opponent sees it coming. And worse for those steel matchups, they'll break the item before you even get a chance to use it. So save it for when you have a character in play that can quest, and use it to boost your lore then. It can be especially sneaky for some matchups like Ruby, if they think they can get away with leaving Cusco alive for 1 turn when you're sitting at 16 lore, and you drop the Eye of Fates and chalk them and get that 4th lore and take the game. That's all that I had about the Turquoise High Five deck profile. Be sure to comment down below what tech options you would try for this deck, and what deck profiles you hope to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe, as I'll definitely be doing an upgraded version of this deck once we see the full release of the Rise of the Bloodborne. So pick up your decks and head out there, as it's time to glimmer on.